power failures in this area in the last couple of months than all the years put together I've lived here. It's very odd.
Yeah, and you were about to do the next day after you exposing Jimmy Savile theory about the Yorkshire murderers. You lost power again. Do you want to tell us about that? It's happening quite often, you say.
Yeah, well, that hasn't been. That wasn't a power failure. That was the actual inside of the phone jack was fried. The most strangest thing, as if I was actually hit directly by lightning, and there was no lightning. The house has never been hit by lightning, never. Not since I've lived here. And I did a show on my old radio program called The Velocity of Now, and it was an expose of furthering my work of David Gallup's work into the Yorkshire Ripper. I basically came to the conclusion that Jimmy Savile was an accomplice in at least one of the murders, of that of Irene Richardson, who was found in Soldiers Field in Leeds, literally in Savile's back garden. And then it transpired later that Savile was indeed a suspect at the time. And so I got there and I was doing the show, and it was very powerful. It was a very intense experience. There was all kinds of weird noises all over the transmission broadcast. And the next day I couldn't get online at all, and when I looked, I called the phone guy out, and when he came to look, he showed me the phone jack, and the internal circuit was completely fried, as if a high voltage had been fired at it.
Very strange. I remember one time we had a guest coming on to talk about geomancy and the occult significance of ley lines and geomancy in general. And he was due to join us on Saturdays as a host on These Changing Times Radio.ning.com. And his computer was completely fried. So was the producers in Kansas. I lost my computer as well. Hard drives fried. And my mobile phone the same day. So we all got fried, even though we're on opposite ends of the earth almost. So it is quite common, I believe, to have mini pulses directed at your systems via satellite or by whatever other means. It's perfectly easy through your computer to mess about with people trying to get the truth out there and that are desperate about the world and trying to get things sorted in the minds of the public so we can make a difference. And we're the enemy of evil people. So I like to keep an open mind, but I've heard many stories about electromagnetic attacks on the physical health of people. And I know very well that computers can be accessed directly as well and messed around with, and you slow down. I mean, have you ever typed anything, Thomas, and it's going really slow and one letter at a time, and then suddenly it appears even though you press enter, your computer right slows down.
Yeah, I also believe that I know for a fact that they monitor certain code words. And when a sequence of code words that they're wary of, a string of code appears, it's probably at some point releases some kind of carrier wave to actually to damage the transmission or slow it down. I really do believe that. But I'd also even go further than that. I think there's actually people paid in psychic attacks who are actually employed by the services and so on like that to actually psychically attack people through literally through mind games.
Well, I mean, a lot of the MK Ultra stuff back in the 60s is obsolete now, so who knows what they have. If they got a brain chip that can enhance certain abilities, that's like Sixth Sense or telepathy perhaps, then you may be true, yeah. But,
yeah,
I mean, who knows?
I actually think it's probably even more simple than that. I think they
just a computer program, probably, yeah.
No, they're probably even as simple as agents who identify people who are in this scene who are mentally unstable or have psychological issues, prone to extreme paranoia to the point where they literally would think that their goldfish is a spy, and they will actually befriend those people on social media and so on, and feed their mental illness or feed their paranoia to have them attack other people in the movement. This has been going on since the Russian Revolution. So the Bolsheviks first developed this, and they would do it through whispering campaigns and things like that. And they would just find the local lunatics in the town and use them to sow havoc. Well, they're still using it today, except they're doing it on the internet, where a sort of a person who's like extremely unwell can have his or her paranoia fed and cultivated by a friend, quote unquote friend, who's been sent there by the intelligence services to basically work on them and to make them even more disturbed. It's very dark up stuff, extremely dark. We're dealing with monsters that have their humanity vanished a long time ago.
Well, I was attacked in the bus station for no apparent reason. The very evening I was due to meet somebody from the Occupy movement who contacted me and wanted to meet and hand out chemtrail leaflets with me. And getting the bus, I had the most vicious attack of my life. I had to brawling in the bus station, you know. So, and you wonder. Oh, it's a bit of a coincidence, you know. It might just be because people are getting crazier, you know. But it was just a bit of a coincidence, you know. Yeah. It does go on, you know. And the electromagnetic attacks on Alex Hunter in Canada is just off the scale. And yes. He documents it and basically is offering himself up as a lab rat and explaining what's happening to him, describing what's happening to him for years now. And
also people who are they're saving money now by health services by releasing people who should not be on the streets off the streets. And there's been so many murder suicides like that in Ireland lately of people who had they'd been discharged as well, and they weren't well. They had given them medication, turned them into zombies, and then said, oh, they're well enough to go home, even sometimes against their family protesting it. Yeah. Thrown out on the street to save money, and then the medication wears off and they kill themselves or someone else. Or
that's both. It, yeah. Yeah, a friend of mine had electric shock treatment for some time, years ago, and when I said to him, and his brother is a complete mess, and when I suggested to him that these mentally ill people are allowed back on the streets to cause havoc and to be a further experiment with the medication or whatever, he couldn't see that being true at all. Even though he'd suffered himself at their hands, you know.
Yeah.
But, it's very common now for people to be thrown in mental hospitals because they differ with the government's view.
Yeah, and then thrown out again after some medication.
I mean, Ezra Pound is a good example. One of the greatest writers, you know. Now, Thomas Sheridan, I had the great pleasure of meeting you at the Glastonbury talk. It was a fascinating talk. I took some notes, and I'm sorry I don't have them with me now because there's a few things I want to ask you from that. It was an excellent talk, and anyone checking out Thomas SheridanArts.com, your website, is that the right address?
Yeah, that's correct.
ThomasSheridanArts.com. He's an author from Ireland, an author and an artist, and a very good artist, I might say. I like some of your paintings a lot.
Thank you.
Especially the older ones, actually, for some reason. They're more colourful and striking and a bit darker, if you don't mind me saying. I enjoy those just as much as the modern ones. But please check out his site to see his books that he's written on various subjects like psychopaths. And I brought you on today to bring you a bit of attention towards your new book, which I'm absolutely excited about reading, and I should have got a copy before the show. So we'll review it as we go along with yourself. And can you explain a bit more about this new project of yours?
Well, I've written 2 books on psychopathology, both one in the personal and social sense, and one in the what I call the psychopathic control grid, the actual top-down pathology and psychopathology of the leadership structure of this world and its disregard for human life beyond that as seeing us as human resources or farm animals on a taxation farm. And there was a section in that where I dealt with Bolsheviks, and I dealt with cultural Marxism, and it would have not been fair to have looked at National Socialism in the same way, because basically they were both created by aristocrats at the end of the day. Now, I'd then written another book called The Anvil of the Psyche, which was a book I very much enjoyed on social engineering. And when I was finished that, in the contemporary sense mainly, when I was finished that, I said I'd really love now to tackle a historical subject.
Yeah.
And like so many people, and lay the work I'd done already, the talk you'd seen me do in Glastonbury was on culture as a weapon.
Yeah.
And this is a topic that fascinates me. And
I just found the notes actually, so remind me to come back to you later on that.
Excellent. So that was culture as a weapon, and then you cannot look at that without looking at the history of National Socialism.
Yeah.
Because the way they use cinema, the way they use sound, the way they used theatrics, the way they used graphic design, the way they played on the subconscious mind, in a very different way than the Bolsheviks did. I wanted to understand how they did it, why they did it, and why it worked so well on the German people.
Well, exactly. When I sorry to interrupt, but when I read a couple of books about World War One from these field marshals, they were trying to understand. This journalist went back to Germany after World War One and tried to understand what brought them to the brink of such destruction, and he delved into the propaganda and everything else, and whether he was working for the elite at the time or not, his conclusion was, well, the German are naturally obedient people. You know, that wasn't enough. There's serious psychology and behind this propaganda, ages old.
Yes, and they were not naturally obedient. They had literally been changed.
Yeah.
And this is the warning for the future,
yeah.
That you can take a people and you can change them, and you can change their consciousness into an almost different version of reality, and then place them in this reality and then say to them, this is how the world is. And you play on their insecurities, you play on their fears, you play on the darker aspects of their psyche. Look, I mean, culturally and collectively, Germans are no different than anyone else. I'm talking about like their cultural archetypes.
Yeah, I've lived there, I know.
Yep, and so that's where Walpurgis Night Volume 1 came from. It's part of a trilogy to look at the supernatural and psychic aspects of the Third Reich in such a way I don't think it's been done before. It's been looked at in other ways. But as you said, the book really begins in Munich on April 30th, Walpurgis Night, 1919. And the book reads very much like a novel in that style, even though it's factually and historically accurate. But I had to throw back in the style of a novel, very much in the style of, say, a book by, say, a novel that would be like, you know, an American-style novel, such as The Grapes of Wrath, that kind of style, where it flicks back through, where Steinbeck flicks back through the historical development of the figures. And so that style of writing has always appealed to me.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting, that's quite a significant sort of change of tack. It's there was a
deliberate reason for that.
Well, it's an artistic device, isn't it? It's an artistic, yeah.
We've lost our storytellers, and it was important for me to bring back the tradition of the person standing around the campfire, just like in Viking or Celtic or Anglo-Saxon times, sitting around the campfire and relaying history in that manner, in an almost oral tradition. So people tell me when they're reading the book, they can hear my voice speaking. This is a very specific thing, because academia and I have read so many academic written authored books on this history, and they're cold and they're dead. They have no life in them, and therefore the story is only told in sort of like spasms of sort of like shimmering truths that come out in a paragraph somewhere, and then it's instantly killed off again with some kind of very cold analytical insight into German economics or something like that.
Or you have to have a very intricate knowledge of Masonic reading between the lines. It may be there, but you don't know what you're looking at, you know.
Precisely. I also know a lot about magic, so it was good for me to actually pull it out. And I believe I pulled the real story out. The real story, the story of the history of the psyche of the German people that led to this. That's what's led to us, because remember, it's been exported after World War II to us through everything from Operation Paperclip to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was very much about taking what they understood of it, not only injecting cash into Europe, but also finding ways they could actually, fund and take care of the good stuff that was useful.
Yeah.
Particularly corporations. Corporations learned an enormous amount from National Socialist companies such as Volkswagen, and how to even market products that was never thought of in Europe or America. For instance, like there's a book by David Welch called Politics and Propaganda in the Third Reich, and it shows how they were fascinated by how Volkswagen marketed the car as the symbol of freedom. And we were the first person to attach a woman to a car. So you get the car, you get the woman. That was happening in Germany in the 30s. Hadn't even been thought about yet by the Americans or any other European country.
Yeah.
And these things were taken. So it's a story of where they've extracted what they needed from it, while at the same time destroying the German personality and the German culture. And they've extracted the good stuff, and they've made robots of a nation. And then they're making robots of us through transhumanism.
It is a kind of robotic trance that people were led into via through National Socialism from the late 20s.
Yep.
The people of Germany were trained and ready for the war. The bankers knew the war was coming. They were funding it into existence. They needed another one to bring in more social change, and so nations would be fed up with war, and the League of Nations could take the rightful place as a precursor to the United Nations. So people were trained for their role in bringing about another world war long before, and maybe World War One was part of that too. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that.
It's a continuum. Now, to really look at it, we have to go quite far back in history to go back to the Teutonic Knights.
Yep.
Teutonic Knights were a religious military order of quite remarkable power that existed along the coast of the Balkans. Well, they actually had their beginning in Acre, which I think is in modern Turkey or Syria now, in 1192, and they were staying in the Middle East until 1291. So they were nearly 100 years in the Middle East fighting the Muslims, fighting the Saracens, fighting the religious holy wars. They came back to Europe, particularly the Balkans, with a very different mindset than had been previously seen in Europe before. I believe that they actually became infected. I believe that something happened to them in the Middle East that changed them, it exposed them to dark archetypal forces within Middle Eastern religions, within Abrahamic religions.
Yeah,
and through the violence and through the actual experience of being there, this messianic quest of extreme violence, I might add, they were infected. They returned back to Europe, and they went mainly to live in northern Poland, what we now call the area around Danzig, Kronigsberg, Latvia, Lithuania, that part of the world, and became very, very quickly a very powerful political force. Then Frederick the Great attacked basically and invaded Prussia, and this is where the story really begins.
Well, that's interesting in itself, the fact that he was called Frederick the Great. If there's a great involved, the high priesthoods are behind them, if they give them the title Great. Alexander the Great, Frederick the Great,
Peter the Great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they were definitely Catherine the Great, don't forget his women too. And they were deeply esoteric. If you just look at their coat of arms, it has it all going on. They were a deep Masonic esoteric force, military force. When they landed in Prussia, that's when Germany really began. Now, there were Germanic and Teutonic tribes there since the Romans, and they were wild. They were a wild people.
They were always a problem, yeah.
Very much like the Celts or the Vikings. They were the classic barbarian warriors that the Romans and the civilized world feared.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Romans the Germanic tribes were always a problem for the Romans, and they never quite finished them off. So it seems like there's been a quest to use Germany and take revenge on the German regions, in modern times. World War One, World War Two. That's just a theory of mine. But
no, you're not far off there, Pat.
They
it's
knew
like what's been done to the Gaels and the Druids, and the Celts.
Exactly, yeah. But they were after the knowledge as well when they went to the Middle East with the Crusades. They were after the mind control knowledge. It was
They brought back the Spear of Destiny, which plays a huge part in the story as it develops.
Yeah.
So anyway, what happened? Prussia became a nation. It developed from that point. Now, even though Prussia was quite a large area in northern Germany, basically from the Dutch border all the way to the Balkans, and then south, maybe as far as just north of Bavaria. It grew very powerful and very strong very quickly, and it exercised its influence on the rest of Germany. Germany was probably made of about 11 or 1,200 different states, right up until nearly World War One, believe it or not. Well, at least up until Bismarck and the consolidation of Germany by the empire by Bismarck.
Yeah, people forget that. Yeah,
it really was hundreds of thousands of states nearly. Prussians had a tremendous influence on the rest of Germany, and through history they developed and cultivated very specific forms of aristocracy, and this is where it gets really interesting. Through series of inbreeding, selective breeding, I might add, and this is where I believe what was going on with these aristocrats. They were infected since the time they brought back the jinn, or whatever you want to call it, from the Middle East. They had very, very specific breeding programs. By the time the end of the 1600s, the beginning of the 1700s to the mid-1700s, nearly every European royal family, from Russia to the British Isles, was of Germanic descent, specifically this Prussian aristocratic strain that had went back all the way to the Teutonic Knights.
It's the occult blood that they want to keep in their families, isn't it?
Well, that's a huge aspect when we get later on into National Socialism. We'll be prior to that. What then developed was in Prussia was a cruelty that's hard to believe inflicted on the Prussians. The aristocrats, from, as you said, this idea of magical blood, came to believe themselves as almost angelic beings, very different than any other German or any other human being.
A new species, a different species.
Yeah, and this psychology, or this psychosis, or this psychopathic psychosis, is what we have in the royal families to this day, and indeed the black nobility of Rome, which gives us most of the popes and the papacy.
Venice,
A belief, that's why I refer to them as the Romano-Prussian aristocrats. This is the real power behind it all, folks. I know people are so quick to say, oh, the Zionists, oh, the Freemen. Yes, all those people are all involved, but there's the top of that pyramid, the ultimate ones behind it are these Teutonic, Central European aristocratic blue bloods.
The black nobility,
The goldsmiths, the Rothschilds exist. Yes, they came out of Frankfurt, but remember, they were employed, just like Whitestaff, the Illuminati, were employed as subcontractors for Teutonic royalty.
Yeah.
See, people they go one step, but don't go to the final step. The final step all leads back to these, what they call Serene Highness types, all over the Germanic aristocratic bloodlines. This is the power base. This is the British royal family. This is what they are. Now, they had such a disregard for human beings who were not of their ilk that up until nearly the 20th century, Prussian aristocrats had the legal right to use corporal punishment on their subjects, particularly their workers, in the same way that they had them on animals. In fact, animals were treated better, and the corporal punishment often led to beatings to death. There are illustrations of aristocrats beating Prussian men to death with a stick while his dog looks on because he probably tried to get some of the dog food for himself. This is how badly the normal Prussians were treated. The monsters were gestating among them. These monsters that they carried from the old Saxon tribes who lived in the woods and the deep forests, they actually manifested as the aristocrats. Now, these aristocrats had a spectacular, shall we say, this is one of the most important events in history, and yet so few people outside the German world know about it. And it involves Frederick II of Prussia. Now, Frederick II of Prussia was born in the early 1700s, and in many ways he was an aristocratic anomaly, very similar to Princess Diana, in that he was a human being, you know what I mean? He seems to have had normal behavioral traits. He wasn't, although he was an excellent scholar and he did well at military academy, he was not interested in empire and war building and warmongering that was traditionally the case with the Prussian nobility.
Yeah.
He was an artist, he was a thinker, and he was called the Gentle Frederick when he was a young man. And what's happened next is one of the most remarkable and horrifying stories in history. He developed a homosexual relationship with a young man, his best friend, called Hans Hermann von Katte. The two of them somehow became aware that there was a psychic disorder within the Prussian court, in that they understood there was something profoundly wrong with the Prussian and Germanic royal families. They had witnessed things that they found repulsed them, and they were aware that Germany had to change.
Yeah.
Now, what happened next was they were planning to run away. There was no proof there was a political mandate, but they were planning to run away to England to see King George III as gay lovers. They wouldn't have been openly gay. They would have been just like two young men running away, and they were captured. And what happened was that the father, Frederick I, whipped up basically charges that him and his son and von Katte were going to England to raise an army to come back and invade Prussia. Now, Frederick I wanted to kill his own son, and he also wanted to kill von Katte, but according to the edicts of the Holy Roman Empire, which is another interesting one, it's like almost like a charter that existed to control the conduct and blood rituals and breeding of royals, he couldn't kill his own son. So instead, he ordered Frederick in his cell, and I have an illustration of it, which I'll be showing to people on my upcoming UK speaking tour, of the son Frederick II being forced to look at his lover von Katte being decapitated in front of him. Now, isn't it interesting that things are all coming back to like ISIS and stuff? This is not normal behavior. What happened then was Frederick fell into a psychedelic haze. He went into an extreme psychedelic state, and this is very commonly reported throughout German history, from Adolf Hitler to people like Lanz van Liebensfeld, the founder of basically what we call, racial magic. They fall into a trance. In that trance that lasted several days, he saw the ghost of his murdered lover, he saw demons, had everything. He was screaming and howling. When he came out of the trance, he was a completely different person.
Mm-hmm.
He was almost transhumanized. He came out of the trance, and he was no longer the gentle and artistic Frederick. The Frederick II went on to invent the modern Europe and the Western world of the day. And he had, by employing new methods and everything from mass agriculture, education, diplomacy, military, industry, all as a result of these psychedelic visions he had received while in this trance, followed having the horror of watching his boyfriend being murdered. He invented the Prussian education system, which is now everything is based on today. He changed the Germans. He created and changed them into a different breed of people.
Would that be your trauma-based mind control? Seeing the beheading?
It naturally developed. That's the most amazing thing. It naturally developed in him. But it did. I think they learned right there and then that trauma. I think Frederick learned that his own experience allowed some supernatural force to enter into him that changed him into a robot. And he ran Germany and Prussia like a machine. Tremendous military victories against the Austrians and the French. More so, the cruelty never ended. If you were in the Prussian army, you were more likely to be killed by a Prussian officer than you were by Napoleon.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The savagery, the inhumanity could ramped up. It was almost like the Prussian aristocratic bloodline was trying to correct itself with Frederick II in the same way the Saxe-Gotha-Coburg tried to correct itself with Diana. And they rejected and killed it.
Yeah, she wasn't of common stock.
Yeah, and they learned so much from it. That's where they learned to beat people in the army, to discipline them. So the Germans, they finally had the tools to change the Germans. And as you said, it was a form of trauma-based mind control, and education and military training were central to it. And that's where the real story of how the Germanic people were changed, and how the elites and the aristocrats learned that you could, by getting in and attacking the psyche of a person, you could actually change the whole world. And
if there is such a thing as ancestral memory, by the time World War II and Hitler comes around, all they have to do is just sort of re-engage it, reignite it, perhaps.
Especially the darker and old stuff.
Yeah.
What you could do is you make things like the Slavs and the Jews and the Poles, you make them sound like the monsters. You reinvent them as your ancestral monsters of the dark forest that your ancestors lived in.
The wolves, indeed.
Playing on the subconscious archetypes or diseases, ancestral memories of great plagues. Transfer that into the idea of an ethnic group that's a plague.
Yeah.
Very powerful and dark stuff still going on to this day. And that idea passed down through the Prussians specifically, but eventually when Bismarck consolidated Germany to form the German Empire, the education system was so spectacularly successful, was so that Prussia and Germany became an enormous power, particularly after the Battle of Waterloo. I mean, this is another way. I know we're going way back in time. You really have to look back a bit to look where we,
and further, absolutely, yeah.
100 years before World War I, in 1814, you had the Treaty of Paris. This was basically the end of the war between France and the Sixth Coalition. The Sixth Coalition was Prussia, Austria, Austria-Hungary, and Great Britain. Basically, Napoleon had been taken out, and Napoleon, although it had its faults, they were trying to create a new confident nation in Europe. The aristocrats didn't like that. They wiped out Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, all over by then. Now, they had the Treaty of Paris on May 30th in 1814, and these treaties in Paris and Vienna seemed to constantly pop up through history. And what happened then was the royals the elites took a piece of the action from the French Republic, and they didn't use it so much, but they learned all the good things from the Freemasonic end of it. They could use. They basically, after the end of the war, they reinstated the Bourbon monarchy in France. So it was Louis the 18th, and so all the French who died from the French Revolution through the Napoleonic Wars all died for nothing. The royal family, the Bourbons, again, of the Prussian, their actual background is Romano, black nobility, so they're back in power again. And also, the royals then moved away further from, but all done in a very occult manner, I might add, in a very occult way, moved away to create new administrative centres and opened up the consolidation or the recognition of places such as Belgium and Switzerland as where they would do their transnational banking, their aristocratic business, their mercantile activities, outside the framework of royal decrees, while still serving the Romano-Prussian elite who controlled all the banks, shipping companies and everything. 100 years later, they were ironing out the kinks in those problems at what they called the Great War. But this is really where it began, because they turned Europe into a Masonic business, but still controlled by the aristocratic families.
Yeah.
And they turned European people into almost experimental lab rats.
Yeah.
And they would alter with other treaties. They would, change things with the education system, the agricultural system, feeding people in certain ways, military training.
Efficiency. Overall efficiency of a society.
Exactly.
Global society.
In their very occult framework, which is like really weird. However, they were smart enough to know, we're still talking Germany now, that the German people were a very deep-rooted, as you said, racial memory, cultural archetypal people, just like the Celts, just like the Vikings, the Saxons, that ancient Saxon Teutonic soul was still in there, and so a void was created, particularly because of the religious situation in Germany. In southern Germany, you had mainly Catholics. But in northern Germany, you had Lutherans, and there was no magic in that religion. You know what I mean? You didn't have the transubstantiation of the Catholic Mass. It didn't exist in Lutheranism. It existed. So there was a sort of a vacuum, a need for magic in the people, and so you had. By the time the 1850s came along, you had the growth of these magical orders within German society that came along with people presenting the idea from the aristocrats that Germanic blood was charged with a magical power. It was completely charged with a magical power, Germanic blood. And it's the Germans, but they were being lied to. It was a double cross. They were being lied to because the aristocrats felt this way about themselves. They didn't feel this way about the Germans, but they posed this idea on aristocratic, upper middle class Germans that if they kept their blood pure, that the Germanic people would actually ascend to super beings. Now, this came to kind of, shall we say, fruition with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, where the robot the robotically created, as you said, trauma mind-controlled German soldier, was put on the battlefield and sent out against the traditional army, the French, and absolutely hammered the shit out of them. It was a phenomenal, under Willem I, it was a phenomenal military victory. Now,
so they'd already grasped the importance of mind control within the military forces to be an efficient fighting force.
Precisely, the French officers.
And they'd got this from their work in the Crusades.
No, this has been developed through the Prussian education system, following the psychedelic experience of Frederick II.
Yeah, but the high priesthoods in the Crusades, as I mentioned earlier, they'd accumulated this knowledge of mind control in their militaries, and brought it back to Europe and refined it and
scientifically updated it. Yeah. For instance, the education system developed things like timetables. 1 1s are 1, 1 2s are 2, that kind of thing. 9 9s are 99.
Oh, is that where it came from? The Prussians?
Yeah. This is marching in the brain.
I never learnt mine. I never learnt my times table.
Yeah, they realized. What they did then was they realized it was. Well, they didn't know precisely, but they probably did. It was changing neural pathways to make people repetitive, children repetitive. Now, when they went into the army, they were already drilled. The French generals at the decisive Battle of Sedan, where the Prussians scored the penultimate victory over, or the ultimate victory over the French army, even capturing the emperor. Both the French royal families who were there on the scene and the German generals, or the French generals, spoke that the Russians were like machine men. This was the expression they used. They were machine men.
Right.
They were automatons.
Yeah.
And so,
in their countenance or in their physical way that they moved or fought?
Superbly drilled, incredible discipline, phenomenal at fighting.
Like the Spartans, they were mind controlled really, and to be the best warriors, eh?
Followed orders without questions, walked into artillery even if it was blown to bits, wouldn't care.
World War I,
totally under the service of the officer class. And so the European powers and the Americans as well says, well, we'll have a piece of that. And that's how the Prussian education system was eventually exported to the whole world.
Well, isn't it sad that war is tragic and heartbreaking enough to see young men, young women being slaughtered, but when you consider that they're doing it out of mind control, that's even sadder, isn't it? You know.
Yeah, well, they have to, because people, a sane person is not going to fight for a king.
I mean, that's why. I mean, I'm jumping around a bit here, but please continue what you're saying. But so the work you've done on psychopaths and how to recognise them, if that was in the modern curriculum, there would probably be less war.
Oh, there probably would be, because people would learn to avoid the ones who are leading them to the gates of hell.
Right.
So that's really what the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the phenomenal military success of Prussia, followed by the consolidation of Germany into the German Empire, coupled with the growth of these magical, scientific blood orders, is where our story really begins. I know it's a long build-up, but you really have to look back.
Exactly. No, I appreciate it.
So here we have a situation, and this is when my book, we're getting close to when Walpurgis Night 1 takes off. I'm setting the stage.
This is 1919, Walpurgis Night?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was an individual called Lance van Liebensveld. He was the leader of a group called the Order of the Templars. There you go again. And he had a cult, basically. And they were now developing in a cult situation.
Yeah.
Just like Jonestown, just like any of these cults we hear about, the Solar Temple or any of these ones, they were developing the same ideas within a supernatural, spiritual sense. Same thing, trauma-based mind control through the supernatural sense. And Lance van Liebensveld, hoisted above the castle, the ruined castle where he was at, a flag that had what was referred to by some at the time as the Sigil of Thor. The hammers of Thor in perpetual motion, and that was the swastika, raised for the first time. It was raised above the castle, under the stars, in a supernatural rite to infuse Germanic blood with that of the cosmos. The same time this was happening, the operas of Richard Wagner were being laid out on the world, which played on the same ideas. Wagner was
the Superman,
not only at musical quests and always being portrayed by witches. Wagner was not only a musical genius, but he was also a genius of stage design.
Oh, exactly. I mean, it was like going to the cinema. He was the first composer to put the orchestra out of sight. So you're literally getting a cinematic experience.
And each character in the opera had their own theme, playing on a massive, using lighting effects, constant use of dark and light and shadows. Very powerful stuff.
Almost like a Nazi Nuremberg rally. But
that's where it comes from. That's what we're leading up to.
That was at night, and lights and
which came out of magical orders, because anyone who knows, if you know about ritual magic, it's candlelit for that reason, because not so much, even if magic is not real, it focuses the human consciousness into a pure stream of energy. And Wagner was an instinctual magician. He knew how to do this. At the same time this was going on, there was all kinds of other literary and associated movements which are rising up in Germany with the same idea. And then a book was published with a very strange title about an order of beings that lived inside the earth called the Vrilya.
The Vril group, yeah.
Yeah, and this was a fictional novel that was one of the oldest science fiction novels ever, of these angelic beings who, through preservation and of their blood, had ascended to basically supernatural technological
godhood,
yeah, in the center of the earth. And the Vrilya would return to Earth with their wonder weapons if Germanic blood was cleansed of contamination. Foreign races. You see where it's all going? This is way back in the 1880s now we're
Sounds
talking.
familiar, yeah.
But
But just to interrupt for a second, I mean, we've looked at ancient history, and I've covered ancient history with various people across the radio over some years, and looked into it a great deal myself. And we are looking at a long-term plan for a global government, a one world order. So this has been going on a long time. To the consolidation of the Germanic tribes from thousands, as you say, hundreds of thousands maybe, into Prussia, and slowly but surely over the centuries consolidating the sovereignty and tribes into countries, and then blocks, and then European unions, and it's a very slow, gradual. They have patience and time on their side.
Yeah, because they're actually viewing it in the same way of Darwinian natural selection. They're saying it's not going to happen quickly. It has to happen like Darwinism has happened over millions of years.
Yeah.
And remember, the initial spark was the Teutonic Knights in the Middle East infected with what I call the Babylon mind. So the story really begins with the Babylonians.
Oh yeah.
So that was the touch paper that brought it to Europe.
And the Phoenicians, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just so deep. So deep it goes.
Sorry, you were saying about the Vril group.
Yeah. So anyway, the novel was a sensation at the time, not only in Germany but all over Europe, all over the world. So much so that many people believed it was true. They said, this story is so amazing, so well written, it can't possibly be fiction, it must be the truth. So this is when the reality between fiction and truth merged.
Mm-hmm.
You know the way people watch a movie like Avatar and they think they're one of the Na'vi? They
yeah. At the time when Avatar came out, there was people coming out of the cinema that just wanted to end their life because the planet Earth, as they knew it, wasn't like Avatar.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, what is in there?
Yeah, well, that sort of psychosis of the psyche was developed. That was happening in Germany in the 1880s with this book, Brilliant, The Coming of the Super Race.
Not many become a bestseller off their own back. They're massively funded.
When distribution was much more difficult. Yeah.
Right. So in those days, were the elites, the aristocrats, with all their money pushing this Vril book?
Yep.
Right. Okay.
And then Lance van Liebensveld, on the banks of the Danube, produced a magazine called Ostara.
Oh yes, and which Hitler read avidly.
Yes, and quite a very interesting magazine, I might add too.
Huh?
It had articles about transhumanism they didn't call it transhumanism, they called it electronic God, the merging of the soul with the machine. This was also not only influencing people within sort of nationalist tendencies, racial superiority, but also filmmakers such as Fritz Lang, who took the same idea to his movie Metropolis, where the soul is merged with the robot at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, Germany was gestating into a powerhouse of culture, art. It was just like, it was the United States of its day in terms of its incredible influence on the world, culturally and every other way. Germany was becoming a powerhouse.
Thomas, I think you've put a lot of different points together, and I think you really cracked it this time, buddy.
Thank you.
I really want you to talk at some stage about the Franz van Stuck painting that was painted at a specific date, at a significant time for a future leader, of a future leader's birth, and how art was used in propaganda to mind control the public, along with Wagner and everything else. But I really want you to, the listeners, to take a look at this painting of Wild Hunt, perhaps
of Wotan, the Teutonic version of Odin, painted while Adolf Hitler was in the womb of his mother, incredibly enough.
1889, yeah.
Yep, that shows a depiction of Wotan ravaging across the east among burnt buildings, raped women, ravaged corpses, and the image of Wotan is precisely 100% the adult Adolf Hitler, right down to the trademark Charlie Chaplin moustache and a forelock comb to one side.
Mm-hmm.
Don't believe me, look it up.
It's Hitler's face.
It's Hitler's face.
You know what it reminded me of? When in the fictitious film The Omen, they go to Israel and they see Damien's face on the wall.
Oh yes, very good.
It reminded me of that.
And also, even more remarkably, Van Stuck at the same time painted a beautiful painting of Medusa, who was a dead ringer for Hitler's mother Carla. The same steely blue eyes.
The eyes, yeah. The same.
And Hitler came to own both those paintings, Philip.
Oh, is that right? Is that right? Oh, well.
Yes.
Well, I mean, how what a coincidence. But how much?
Well, magic is black magic too. I know this sounds weird to people.
Well, how much involvement how much involvement in secret occult societies must you have to did somebody commission this painting? How did they know that this chap was coming? You know, well, the bankers set him up. He didn't know he was a Rothschild until later in his career.
Well, before we get to that...
Yeah. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. Yeah.
Let's talk about something called the collective unconscious. Below space and time and perception, artists have an ability to see the future before it happens. Carl Jung had a vision. He was an artist, remember? Of World War I, on the eve of World War I. It's happened to me. It happened to me with Walpurgis night. Artists, when they're in the muse, have an ability to see the future before it happens. It's not that spooky. Really, it comes from they're somehow able to tap into the collective unconscious, and Carl Jung pointed this out, and they're able to see history right before it happens in a kind of a shamanic trance-like state. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened Van Stuck.
Well, can we assume that the elites who are instigating a new leader, a dark messiah, if you like, for, grooming him for the future, keeping an eye on him as a boy, we know that, I'm jumping ahead again, but we know that Hitler as a boy was taught by the New Templar Order before joining the Thule Society and various other groups, and the Vril group. But are you sitting back as an elite social controller and looking at artists that are emerging and going, yes, he's picked up on that with our collective consciousness. Keep an eye on that painter. He seems to be on the right track. We'll promote him or whatever, you know.
Yes, and that's why they've been very interested in everything from cinema to rock music. Instead of culture accidentally creating the future, they create the future by perverting culture. This is what Laurel Canyon and Dave McGowan's work is really all about.
Well, that's another step over from culture creation that Plato talked about.
Precisely, yeah.
That's another step on.
And even John Dee and Francis Bacon and Christopher Marlowe and the Tudor court were doing the same, but nobody took it to the level that the Germans did.
Well, the Greeks would have travelling, as Alan Watt mentions from cuttingthroughthematrix.com, the Greeks would have various theatres, travelling theatres, that were compulsory even for the slaves to go and see, because it would indoctrinate people with the right political views, etc., political correctness as we call it today, or shutting down of creative thought, as I call it. So it goes a long way back to Plato's time and before, and even Plato, according to Alan Watt, finished off his studies in India, you know. So these are very old Indus Valley type.
Well, that's where it comes from, because originally the
swastika,
the origin of that is the procession of Isis at through the Babylonian Gate in Babylon 3,000 years ago. They used to have nighttime processions, just like the Nuremberg rallies, and they discovered that under processions of torches and torchlit processions, human beings were easy to control and hypnotize if you did it at night.
The flickering of the lights,
and also it changes melatonin and serotonin levels in the brain.
Oh, it's chemical too.
Oh, big time.
Well, no wonder they stand up on the hill. No wonder they sit up on top of the horse, on top of the hill, looking down on all the mayhem, like in the Schindler's List film, and laughing at us. No wonder.
And feeding off the emotional energy.
It's feeding like psychic vampires, as Michael Sarian says.
Charging themselves with adrenaline. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the story. We have Van Stucker painted this painting, Volpan the Wild Chase. And so the idea, and this ties in with your theory, Patrick.
The Wild Chase, yes.
The story of something, even though the Germans were created like the European Union, there was never a consolidation of emotional attachment because they were still seeing themselves as Bavarians, Hessians, Prussians, etc., Hungarians. They were not seeing themselves as a solidified German race because of things like language, although the Prussians had tried to address that by killing off, through basically reinventing language, removing all Saxony from the dialect. However, in order to consolidate and this is a lesson we have to learn for the European Union, because same reason Europeans don't feel an emotional attachment to the European Union, but they will try and pull the same psyop out. They decided to come up with the idea of something called the Freie Christus, which is basically the Germanic Christ, a savior, a non-Christian savior who would be a product of Germanic occult background, playing on the legends and stories of German history and German folklore.
Which is,
who would come along at some point and release the magic of the Teutonics, of the Aryans, to supercharge their blood and bring them towards salvation.
Well, some would say, it only lasted 5 years of war and maybe about a decade of power, and so what did that achieve?
Everything.
That's right. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here.
Yeah, but not everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, they didn't really lose the war. The war was essential, whether they lost it or not. They destroyed all the decent blood that might oppose them and threaten them. The Germans that wouldn't settle down to a new system were already mind controlled and sent to their depths. And the real elite Germans, with their magic blood, created the European Union, yeah.
Yep, and they were the Prussian aristocrats too. They didn't do it. That's what I always say. The Nazis won the war, the Germans lost.
Yeah.
That's what happened, really. So anyway, we have this young guy called Adolf Hitler, who is basically a remarkable person, who's extremely scholarly, very interested in opera, Wagner, very ambitious. His own working class kind of way, the best he can achieve.
God, he said he went to Wagner's house and spoke to the widow and said, your husband was my god.
Yeah, he was the only predecessor. That was the exact thing. I have no predecessor except Wagner. Wagner created me. Wagner created National Socialism. So you see, we're back to the idea of Wagner being an instinctual, I'm putting that in quotes, magician. Anyway, this shows the power of culture. Hitler is coming along the scene. At the same time, the Germany starts to fall into a strange kind of state. It's not getting respected by the other powers, even though technologically, culturally, economically, Germany is a superpower. It's being mocked constantly by the British Empire. It's being mocked by the Austro-Hungarians. It's being mocked by the French, and it's being mocked by the Americans. It's constantly being mocked. Germany is a joke nation. It's not a real power. It doesn't have a real national vision. It's just basically a big factory. Germans are not that smart, really. And the Germans were filled with this whole kind of thing, constantly telling them that they were no good, that the rest of the Europeans laughed at them. This was their cousins in places like Buckingham Palace, George V, goading them into war. Mm-hmm. Because what happened in 1913 with the consolidation of the Federal Reserve Act, it transferred much of the money from Europe to North America, temporarily I might add. And they knew this was going to lead to massive unemployment in Europe. And they had to, just like in Plato's Republic, they had to solve the economic crisis of these millions of young men all over Europe out of work by starting what they called the Great War. Germans were
great. There's your great again, yeah.
Germans were led into the Great War being told that their technology wasn't up for it, their army wasn't up for it, they couldn't do it, they weren't that smart. And so the Germans were eager to go to war just to say, screw you, we can fight. But it was a double, you understand, it was like a trap they were played into, a double cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so all these all these European royal families had set up all these different treaties. And if you believe that World War I was caused by Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, sorry, you're just that was nothing to do with it. That was
it's a long, protracted intrigue, isn't it?
Yeah, that was just something they throw in the history books. The war takes off. The Germans enthusiastically run into it, and then trench warfare. This is where it gets really interesting.
Thomas, I'm going to.
Warfare develops.